idea about life cycle modeling is to look at a piece of equipment over its life cycle, the costing and so on of the piece of equipment, with the purpose of replacing the equipment also when it is economic. But more than that, to make sure even from the design that you understand what are the elements of the life cycle cost. So we will be looking at some angles there. So we start with the life cycle stages, which is based on a document by Dr. Nick Hastings in Australia. He was a professor of technology at the University of Queensland. He's retired. The aim of life cycle costing, we say, is to minimize costs over the life cycle of equipment. Say a high proportion of costs are committed at the early stages, that is at concept, at the conceptualization of the piece of equipment. In other words, before the equipment actually exists, conceptualization. The conceptualization, the definition of need, that you need such a piece of equipment, the design of the equipment, and the development of the equipment. In other words, if we say you commit a high proportion of the cost, it means that while you are designing the piece of equipment, you are really fixing certain qualities of the equipment which will, in effect, will model the cost profile of the equipment. In other words, if you don't do the right things up front, early in the life of the equipment, it might be that you have lost an opportunity. Because later on, you have a fixed cost profile that you just have to abide by. So you cannot do much about it then. So that's what Nick Hastings says here. The reference is Standards Australia, a document on life cycle costings, and he says that specific document says the various things that should be done in the life cycle management of a piece of equipment. So they talk about the concept and definition of need. So they have things that should happen there, things that should happen in design and development, in manufacturing and installation, in market research and project management, system concept and design analysis, and the preparation of a requirement specification of the product. I just want to quickly do something to this slide. So here we have a slide then on design and development. Those are the things that is involved in design. So it's just listings. I'm not going to work through that. You can go through that when you study. The next one I also want to prepare before you see it. Manufacturing and installation, and they discern between non-recurring costs during manufacturing and installation, or non-recurring events and costs during manufacturing and installation, and recurring costs and events. And the next slide has the recurring. So the heading is manufacturing and installation 2. So again, you have a listing, and then you have listing during operation and maintenance. So there's the operation list, there is the maintenance list, and then here is supply list and support services, and eventually the list for this proposal. So those are valuable lists. Just if you have to do something with the life cycle, you can go and use that as a checklist to say, well, what are the various things that must be taken into account? What are the various things that we must work on? So when we get into this life cycle thing during subsequent class days, you will find that we need those lists. So that's why they're there. And then our maintenance college, that's now, if I say my maintenance college, I don't mean mine. Me and my colleagues is maintenance college, the technical maintenance college. We have a course called maintenance or life cycle cost analysis and so on. And this refers to that. This comes from the okay, so it looks at basic principles. This is fairly basic. It's just an introduction into the area. Basic principles, modeling approaches, and the modeling strategy. Basic principles, we say introduction. The reason why I feel it's important that one works from such basic principles regarding life cycle cost analysis is that life cycle cost analysis would seem to be not that complicated. And it is not that complicated, but the problem is that we engineers, we tend to backfire when we start being confronted with money calculations, with interest calculations, and so on. And up front, it's very simple. But the moment that you all of a sudden you get into more difficult situations. So when you have to decide when to replace this piece of equipment, capital-wise, it all of a sudden becomes a big problem. And because of that, I start at basic stuff. So, well, this is how it works basically, and then one can progress from there. So, introduction. If I invest 100 Rand for 1 year at 10%, I get 110 Rand back at the end of the year. Very, very simple. So that means, how do we calculate that? It's 100 plus 10% of 100. Or we can write the 10% as 0.1. Or we can take the 100 out of the brackets and we can get 100 times 1 plus 0.1. Or, of course, you could also write it as 100 times 1, 1.1. So after 2 years, then I will get 121 Rand back, which is then 110 times 1 plus 0.1. Or I can write the 110 as the original 100 times 1 plus 0.1, so now I have that squared. And I then get to a general expression that I say that any future amount is the present amount times 1 plus I over 100 to the power n, where n is the number of periods, typically years, that one works with. So, okay. Now, if we now rearrange that, we now have f equals p, and we now rearrange it to be p equals f, we get p equals fr to the n, where we've now set 1 over 1 plus I over 100, we've set as r, which we then call the discount. So we can now calculate the present amount that we need to invest in order to get a future amount at a certain time, at a certain interest rate. Now that we can now start talking about the time value for money. And how do we do that? We say, well, from the previous discussion, it follows that at 10%, 110 Rand in a year's time is the equivalent of 100 Rand today. I can have 100 rand today and I can invest it at the bank and I will have 110 rand. Or otherwise somebody can give me 110 rand now and I'm equally happy. Or not now, but in a year's time. If he says, well, he will give me 110 rand in a year's time, or he will give me 100 rand now, I'm happy both ways. That's what we say there. Thus we can say that the present value of 110 rand in a year's time is 100 rand. And we write that, we now replace the P with PV, where that stands for present value. We say the present value is the future value times R to the power n, where R is the discount rate. So that we can do. So we can sort of work out an equivalence of a certain amount in future to a certain amount now. We can work that out. Now, what invariably happens during life cycle calculations is that people start saying, well, but what about inflation? What about inflation? So we say inflation versus no inflation. So we say that we normally do capital replacement studies in an inflationless mode, as it makes the calculations easier. Inflation just complicates the whole problem. The question is, how can you do that? We say the answers in both cases are the same. So you have no difference in answer. Illustration, if inflation is 8%, using our previous example, I would need 108 rand to get my capital back plus my required interest at a real rate of 10%. Remember we said, well, 10%, which will give you an extra 10 rand on the 100 rand, so we expected 110 rand without inflation. Now we say, but inflation is 8%, so now I need another 8 rand on the 100 rand just to cover the inflation on the 100 rand. Plus I need another inflation on the 10 rand interest, which is another 80 cents. So I need 180 rand, 80 cents back at the end of the year under an inflation situation of 8% with an interest rate of 10%, so as to still get my real interest rate of 10%. Thus we need a with inflation interest rate of 18.8% to obtain a real interest rate of 10%. And that we could show as follows. We can do this little calculation here. That's the formula for that. So we say the real interest rate, we work with an 18.8% interest rate up there. Where is my cursor? No, I can't use my cursor here. But in any case, so what we're saying is that there's my 18.8%, there's my inflation rate, my nominal interest rate, and I can then work out what is the real interest rate, which is then usually 10%. So whether you work with inflation in your figures, if you add inflation in your figures, then you must work with a nominal interest rate, which includes inflation. If you work without inflation in your figures, if you leave inflation out, you must work with a real interest rate. And in both cases, you will get exactly the same answers. So the easier way is to work without inflation and with a real interest rate in calculations. Some modeling approaches. Firstly, the principle of capital replacement. This is fairly simplistic, just to set the scene. The principle of capital replacement says that we basically have two things. We have the cost of operation and maintenance, and we have the cost of capital. So, and these two things added together gives you that total cost. And what you then seek for is you seek to go for the minimum of that total cost, the total capital cost. That is your replacement point. That's what you want to do. As I say, that's very simplistic. Some broad modeling approaches. The one is the life cycle approach, where you could make use of either an infinite time horizon or a finite time horizon in order to calculate and to optimize capital cost versus operational cost. Then you have the challenge and defender approach, where you accept that that the capital or money in the present asset is sunk. So in other words, the life cycle approach, the previous one, you use on a single asset to decide when will you replace it. This one, the challenge and defender, you have a present asset, which you call the defender, and you have a proposed new one, the challenger, with which you intend to replace it. And the calculations is then, you say, well, you accept that the capital in the present asset is sunk, in other words, and you then challenge this asset with the improved ability and the lower cost of the proposed new asset. So the defender has no capital value, no capital cost, there's no capital cost involved, but there is operational maintenance cost involved, and there is production capability involved. Which in both cases, typically you will find that the challenger, which is a newer model, newer type of machine, will do better in terms of operational maintenance cost, will do better in terms of operational capability, but has a high capital problematic, whereas your defender does not have that. So you compare those two against one another, and then the repairable systems approach, you balance the cost of minimal repair against the cost of capital replacement. But that's what we discussed earlier today. Principles of cost and profit modeling. Now we go a little bit deeper, although we're still simplistic, and we divided the process up into two graphs because it becomes too complex, too complicated. So what we said here is, if we have an asset, there's the price of a new asset, and we set that at 100 units. So that's the price of a new asset. And here we have the trading of an old asset. So if we buy a new asset there, then next year we can trade it in for this, and so on. So if we replace it in 1 year's time, what it means is that we have to pay that. We will get this back for the old one, and the difference is this. So this net expenditure is the difference. So after 2 years, we have to pay that. We get this back, so that's the difference, and so on. And this is then divided, this line here, then divided by the number of years. So that quantity, or this quantity divided by 1 year, that quantity divided by 2 years, that quantity divided by 3 years, and so on. So this is the net annual expenditure. When we replace it at 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, net annual expenditure. Now that net annual expenditure has all this information embedded into it. So we just take this line, carry this over to the new graph. So here we have that. And now we add the other stuff. We add the gross income from the asset. We add the cost of operational maintenance. And now we say, well, that minus that gives us this line here, which is the net annual income. Net annual income. And now you say, well, the idea is to replace this machine where this thing peaks. That's the idea. You want them the highest net annual income for a machine. As I say, it's still simplistic, but it explains the concept much better. So we have two main approaches, apart now from the repairable systems approach, which we're not looking at here. The economic service life approach, which is the life cycle approach, which we already talked about a little. We say we typically do the analysis for an infinite or a finite sequence of identical machines. In other words, the idea is you say, well, I now have this machine. When I replace it, I'm going to replace it with an identical unit, and again with an identical unit, with an identical unit, and so on. And then I optimize over that whole sequence of machines as they follow each other up. So that's the idea. We calculate the present value of the net annual income when the asset is replaced at different operating ages. And of course, if income is not involved, then you would look at net annual expenditure. The age at which the net annual income is at its maximum or the net annual expenditure at its minimum is the optimal point. Okay, so that is that one. The other one is the Challenger Defender approach, which you use when an asset's optimal economic life is not the issue, but a new model comes onto the market which delivers more output or has a lower cost of operation. And you then compare the economics in present day only in terms of different replacement strategy options. Okay, and then repairable systems we already looked at. Uses an asset, service, and repair history to calculate the best point of system replacement. Balances the cost of minimal repair against the cost of total system replacement in order to be able to use that. Because you really need good information. Okay. So that's as far as life cycle modeling 1 is concerned. Next time we will take that.